A woman is dying 100 feet from a trail while 40 rescuers, a Blackhawk and a Cessna, hunt her beacon. None of them can reach her. This is Mount Washington, 6,288 feet, where observers clocked 231 miles an hour, the fastest wind humans ever measured. Hurricane-force gusts strike about 110 days a year. That is the easy answer. It does not explain a body found yards from a lit hotel in 1855. So why does a mountain with a road, a railway, and a heated summit keep killing people minutes from shelter? The pattern is old. Start with the ground, because the wind on that summit is not born there. It is imported, and then it is squeezed. The Presidential Range runs roughly north to south across northern New Hampshire, a wall of bare rock standing broadside to the prevailing westerlies. At summit height, air arriving from the west has crossed more than 1,500 miles, with nothing tall enough to slow it down. It shows up already moving. Then the mountain does two things to it at once, and this is the part that makes the place what it is. Horizontally, the range squeezes the flow. The same effect that makes a river run faster through a narrow channel. Vertically, the air has nowhere to escape upward, because the atmosphere has a lid. The tropopause, the boundary between the layer we live in and the one above it, resists vertical motion, so air riding up over the summit gets pinched between the rock and that ceiling. Compressed from the side and from above, it does the only thing left. It speeds up. The summit is not a wind source. It is an accelerator, and it sits at the altitude where low-level jets form, at roughly the latitude the jet stream itself prefers. The numbers this produces are hard to believe until you understand the geometry. A valley wind of 25 miles an hour, the kind that rattles a tarp and nothing else, routinely arrives at the summit at 70 or 80. A gale in the notches becomes something on top that a person cannot stand up in. The multiplier is what kills, and the multiplier is invisible from below. You can stand in the parking lot at Pinkham Notch, in a breeze that barely moves your jacket, 4,000 feet under air that would take you off your feet. There is a third piece, and by the observatory's own account, it is the decisive one. Mount Washington sits at the confluence of three major storm tracks, systems riding down from the Great Lakes, systems spinning up along the Atlantic coast, moisture pumping north out of the Gulf. They all pass over the same summit, when two of them argue about the same piece of sky. The pressure difference between them tightens. Pressure difference over distance is the only thing that makes wind. Tighten it, and you have the raw material. Compress it against the range and against the lid, and you have the mountain. It does not need to be tall. It only needs to be in the way, which brings the whole thing down to a problem of shelter. And shelter is where Mount Washington is genuinely strange. Treeline here sits at roughly 4,400 feet. That number should stop you. In the Rockies, at comparable latitudes, trees climb thousands of feet higher than that. Mount Washington kills its forest at 4,400, which puts it among the lowest tree lines on Earth for its latitude. And it does that because the wind and the ice above that line simply will not let a tree survive. The forest stops where the mountain starts winning. The consequence is arithmetic. The summit is 6,288 feet. Tree line is 4,400. That leaves roughly 1,900 vertical feet of open alpine ground with no trees, no windbreak, no natural cover, and no landmarks. You can walk into it in 3 hours from a parking lot, in sneakers, on a Saturday. Above tree line, the only navigation aid is a cairn. A cairn is a pile of stacked rock, somewhere between waist and head height, built by hand and placed so that from one, you can see the next. The whole system depends on a single assumption that you can see. On a clear day, the cairns turn the alpine zone into a marked corridor. On the wrong day, they vanish. Not knocked down, not buried in snow. Erased while still standing there. Hold that. The mechanism that erases them explains almost every death on this mountain, and it is not the wind. Now come down from the map to one person. A hiker leaves the trees at 4,400 feet on an afternoon with a forecast that looked survivable. The temperature drops as they climb, which they expected. The wind picks up, which they expected. What they did not expect is that the cloud sitting on the summit is not ordinary fog. It is supercooled, liquid water droplets held below freezing, unable to turn to ice because there is nothing for them to freeze onto. Then the droplets hit a person, a jacket, a pack strap, a pair of goggles. Contact gives them what they were missing, and they freeze instantly on the surface they touch, building outward into the wind as a white, feathery crust. That is rime ice, and it grows into the wind, not with it. Rime is why the cairns disappear. It coats them. It coats the rock around them, and it turns a marked route into an undifferentiated white field. It coats goggles in under a minute. It coats the inside of a hood. Vision goes first, and it goes fast. Now the chain finishes itself. Vision gone means the next cairn is gone, which means the route is gone. Wind at 70 or 90 strips heat off exposed skin faster than a body can produce it, and hands stop working before the person notices, because the hands go numb, and numb feels like nothing at all. Fingers that will not close cannot open a pack, cannot work a zipper, cannot pull a shell over a head. Then the cold reaches judgment, which is the quietest failure of all. A person who is hypothermic makes worse decisions and is entirely unaware of it. At that point, distance to shelter stops meaning anything. It is not a hike anymore. It is a search conducted by someone who has lost their eyes, their hands, and their judgment for a building they cannot see. People knew this long before anyone wrote it down. The Abenaki called the mountain Agiokochuk, and the surviving accounts describe it as the dwelling place of a great spirit. Not a summit to be bagged, but a place with rules attached. That was not superstition dressed up as caution. It was an observation system built by people who watched the same peak through every season for generations and encoded the result as prohibition. They used the valleys and the passes. They knew what the mountain looked like when it was about to turn. Turning that into a story about a spirit is an efficient way to transmit a survival rule across generations that have no barometers. The break came in June 1642 when Darby Field, a settler out of Durham, went up the Saco River with native companions on what became an 18-day expedition and made the first recorded ascent. His purpose was not curiosity. The accounts describe a political demonstration staged for the Abenaki leader Passaconaway, at a moment when Europeans were bargaining for tribal land. Proof that the newcomers could stand on the summit and walk away unpunished by whatever was said to live there. Most of the local men refused to go up. At least one went with him. That is the entire pattern in miniature, and it is not a story about belief versus reason. One party was reading a mountain it had watched for generations. The other had an objective and a deadline. Local knowledge says wait, go around, not today. An objective says the meeting is Saturday, the guests arrive Thursday, the train runs at 10, my ride home leaves at 6. Every death that follows sits somewhere on that line. For 2 centuries after Field, the mountain took almost nobody, because almost nobody went. Then, the trails opened, and the ledger started. The first recorded death came on October 19, 1849. Frederick Strickland was 29, from Bridlington in England, and by the standards of the day he was not careless. He was experienced, he was equipped, and he made it to the summit in winter-like conditions. He had done the hard part, everyone agrees on that. He never found the way down. Strickland lost the Fabian path on the descent in an early storm, drifted off route and and ended up in Amina Usuk Ravine on the west side of the mountain in water and cold. He was found there dead. He had shed gear along the way, which is a documented and grimly familiar pattern in severe hypothermia. As the body loses its ability to regulate, people discard equipment they urgently need, sometimes because their hands no longer work, and sometimes because a failing thermoregulatory system tells them they are too warm. That first entry sets the template. The summit is not the goal. It is the halfway point, and it is the point at which you have already spent most of your energy, most of your daylight, and most of your margin. Going up, you are climbing toward a fixed object you can see. Going down, you are navigating a featureless slope with no target, in worsening conditions with a tired body. Strickland proved that the descent is the trap, and he proved it in October, which on this mountain is winter with better daylight. The response was completely rational. If people are getting lost on a bear summit, then put something on the bear summit. Bridle paths were cut. In 1852, the Summit House opened, a wooden hotel standing directly on top of the mountain. The next year, a competitor threw up the tip-top house beside it, this one built of stone, which is why the tip-top is still standing and the Summit House burned in 1908. Suddenly, there were lit, heated, staffed buildings at 6,188 feet, with beds and hot food and people inside them. Problem solved. Except it was not, and the proof arrived 3 years later. In September 1855, Lizzie Bourne, 23 years old, of Kennebunk, Maine, came to climb the mountain with her uncle George Bourne and her cousin Lucy. They left the Glen House on the east side at about 2 in the afternoon, intending to spend the night in one of the summit hotels. They did not hire a guide, and that decision made sense on its face. The route began on the line of the carriage road, then still under construction, and continued on a bridle path. Both were built things. A road implies a certain kind of safety to anyone who has not been above tree line in bad weather. The late start was the first quiet error, and it was not an unreasonable one either. The day was fair when they left. The weather closed on them above the trees. Wind, cloud, cold, and no visibility. This is the specific arithmetic that traps people on this mountain, somewhere on the way up. The distance back down through the storm stops being shorter than the distance forward to the building, and the two swap places without announcing it. Neither number can be measured when you cannot see. A party in that position is not choosing between a safe option and a risky one. It is choosing between two guesses. They kept going as long as they could. Then, in darkness, they stopped and did the only sensible thing left. They piled loose stones into a low wall and got behind it, out of the direct blast, and waited for morning. That is not panic. That is textbook. It is what you are supposed to do. Lizzie Bourne died during the night. At sunrise, the cloud lifted. Her uncle and cousin stood up, and the summit buildings were a few hundred yards away. Sit with that for a second. Not miles. Not across a ravine. A walk of a few minutes. A clergyman named Eastman, who had slept in the tip-top house that night, later wrote that he had been sleeping comfortably while she died a short distance from the door. They had been close enough to shout in air that made shouting useless. They had been close enough to see in cloud that made seeing impossible. That is the rule this mountain runs on. Proximity to shelter is not safety. Proximity plus visibility is safety. Take away the second term, and the first one is worth exactly nothing, which means every building, every hut, every warm room ever constructed on that mountain is conditional infrastructure that works only on the days you least need it. Sources disagree on the date. The New Hampshire State Park fatality list records her death on September 13th. her family genealogy, and the marker raised near the spot both give the 14th. Some accounts also suggest she may have had an undiagnosed heart condition that contributed. That kind of discrepancy runs through this entire record, and it is worth noticing rather than smoothing over. Her death did not slow anything down. It did the opposite. Lizzie Borden became famous, the monument became a stop, and the mountain became a destination with a story attached. In August 1861, the carriage road opened all the way to the summit, 8 years after construction began under a state charter, and the first paying passengers went up behind horses in a Concorde coach. In 1869, the Cog Railway began pushing passengers up the western slope on a steam-driven rack system. Both were engineering achievements. Both did the same thing to the risk profile. Access does not just add people, it changes who the people are. Before the road and the railway, everyone above tree line had walked there. That filtered the population by fitness, by experience, and by the simple fact that a long approach gives you hours to notice the weather changing and turn around. After 1869, a person could be deposited at 6,188 feet in ordinary clothes, having made no decisions at all, and then decide to walk somewhere. The mountain's exposure stayed identical. The competence of the people standing in it collapsed. And here is the part that is easy to miss. It was not only tourists. Experienced people were now arriving with the same modern confidence, and one of the worst days in the mountain's history involved men who were, by any measure, exactly the sort who should have been fine. June 30th, 1900. William Curtis, 63, of New York, and Alan Ormsby, 28, of Brooklyn, set out to walk the 8.5 miles of the Crawford Path to the summit, where the Appalachian Mountain Club was holding its annual meeting at the Summit House. Curtis was not a tourist. He founded the Fresh Air Club. He helped found the New York Athletic Club, and he has been called the father of American amateur athletics. He had spent his life doing exactly this. Ormsby was 35 years younger and strong. They were going to a meeting full of experienced mountain people at a hotel in June. The conditions turned on them as they climbed, and here the record gives us something rare. Their own words, written on the way, before anything went wrong enough to stop them. Partway along the ridge, they stopped at the register kept on Mount Pleasant, the peak now called Mount Eisenhower, and signed it. What they wrote was this: rain clouds and wind 60 miles. Cold. That is the entire entry. They logged the hazard, in their own hand, at a moment when turning around was still entirely possible. Then they continued. Not long after, they met guides coming down who told them the conditions above were bad and advised against going on. That is the warning arriving in person, from people who had just been in it. Curtis and Ormsby kept climbing. Why does a careful person do that? Because the information looked survivable in context. 60 miles an hour is unpleasant, not obviously lethal. They were fit, they were moving well. The summit was closer than the valley, and there was a building at the top with 100 colleagues in it and dinner waiting. Every one of those facts is true, and together they produce a decision that is defensible right up until it is not. What they could not price was what the mountain was doing to itself. Up top, a saturated cloud was driving across its speed near the freezing point, and everything on that summit was plastered in ice, as much as 18 inches of it in places. 18 inches. That is the mechanism that erased Lizzie Bourne's world, running at industrial scale on solid architecture. Whatever was doing that to a hotel was also doing it to two men's faces, hands, and eyes. Inside the Summit House, people knew they were overdue and went out for them. That attempt produced the single most damning number of the day. Searchers heading down the path got about 100 feet before the wind, and the sheeted ice turned them around, and then they had to fight their way back. 100 feet. From a heated building, with the door behind them, by mountain club members who wanted very badly to help. Curtis was found the next morning near the edge of Oaks Gulf, where the Crawford Path meets the loop over Mount Monroe, close to the ground where the Lakes of the Clouds hut stands today. Ormsby got much farther. His body was found a few hundred feet from the summit. He had almost certainly pushed on alone to reach the buildings and bring help back down, which means the last thing he did was try to solve the problem, and he ran out of ground with the roof in sight. Lizzie Borden had already shown that a shelter you cannot see is not a shelter. Curtis and Ormsby supplied the other half of it. The people inside that shelter cannot come out and get you either. Rescue capability does not scale with rescuer quality when the environment closes. Fitness does not help. Company does not help. Being 100 feet away does not help. And it was the last day of June. The Appalachian Mountain Club drew the correct conclusion, which was that the exposed stretch of the Crawford Path needed a bailout point, and it moved fast. Within a year, it had thrown up a rough shack near where Curtis died. By 1915, that had become the Lakes of the Clouds hut, so that a party caught in the open would have somewhere to go that was not the summit. It is a genuinely good fix. It shortens the exposure. It has saved people. It also cannot be seen in rhyme. Everything on this mountain runs into the same wall. By now, the mountain had a body count, a hotel, a road, a railway, and a reputation. But nobody had ever measured what was actually happening up there. In 1932, a small group, Joe Dodge, Robert Monahan, Salvatore Paglucca, and Alexander Mackenzie among them, established a permanent weather observatory on the summit and started living there through the winter. That is the moment the mountain stopped being an anecdote and became data. Measuring wind on that summit is its own engineering problem, and the reason is rhyme again. A standard anemometer freezes solid within minutes in supercooled cloud, and a frozen anemometer does not read low. It reads 0, or worse, it reads something plausible and wrong. So the crew ran a purpose-built heated instrument they called Heated Number 2, and they wired it to a telegraph sounder. The anemometer clicked. To get a wind speed, an observer sat with a stopwatch, timed 3 clicks, and did the arithmetic. That is the whole apparatus. A heated spinning cup, a clicking sounder, and a man with a stopwatch. April 12, 1934. The observatory's own account of the pattern is a textbook pressure gradient machine, and it is not the one you would guess. Low pressure sitting north of the Great Lakes and a second low over Connecticut, with high pressure parked over the Canadian Maritimes. Squeeze a summit between lows to the west and south and a high to the northeast, and the wind does not arrive from the west at all. The big wind came out of the southeast. That undercuts the tidy version of this mountain. The westerlies did not produce the famous number. The gradient is the engine, and it can point any way it likes. The summit is a bare cone, standing above every ridge around it, so it has no sheltered side. Terrain gives amplification, and amplification does not care about compass headings. Wendell Stevenson had been out in the early hours, knocking ice off the instrument to keep it turning. By early afternoon, the building was shaking. Stevenson timed a run at 2:29. Then Paglucca took the stopwatch himself, and at 1:21 in the afternoon, he timed 2 gusts at 3 clicks in 1:17 seconds each, 231 miles an hour. It was not a freak spike either. The 5-minute sustained wind out of the southeast that day was 188. To translate that, at that speed, the air is not pushing on you, it is hitting you. Force from wind scales with the square of the speed, so 231 delivers roughly 9 times the load of a 77-mile-an-hour wind, which is already a hurricane. Gravel becomes ammunition. A person is not blown over so much as removed. And Paglucca, who had just taken the reading himself, wrote down the crew's first reaction rather than their triumph. Will they believe it? Then he listed what worried him: his timing, his method, his calibration curve. That instinct is why the number survived. The anemometer was later put in a wind tunnel at MIT and tested, and the reading held. For 76 years, it stood as the official world record for the highest surface wind speed ever measured. Then, on a Friday in January 2010, a World Meteorological Organization review took it away. An automated station on Barrow Island, off the coast of Western Australia, had recorded 253 miles an hour on April 10, 1996, as Tropical Cyclone Olivia went over it. That anemometer was shipped to Europe for testing, passed, and a WMO committee ruled the gust valid. The world record moved to Australia. What Mount Washington retains, and this is the precise claim, not the souvenir version, is the fastest wind ever measured at a staffed surface station by people. The Barrow Island instrument stood on an island in a Category 4 surfy Miami the Category 4 cyclone with nobody beside it. Nobody had to go outside and clear it. Losing the record did not make the mountain 1 mile an hour safer, because by 2010, the number had long since done its real work. It had turned a hazard into an attraction. Home of the world's worst weather became the observatory's slogan, printed on bumper stickers sold in the Summit gift shop and stuck on cars all over New England. That phrase is marketing, not a ranking. But a slogan repeated for decades becomes a kind of permission. Danger packaged as a brand reads as spectacle, and spectacle draws people who want to see it. The mountain had spent 80 years demonstrating that it kills people who cannot see. Now it advertised, which brings us to the thing nobody plans for, the accident that acquires a second separate victim. January 1982, Jeff Batzer, 20, and Hugh Hare, 17, were both accomplished climbers. Hare was already regarded as one of the strongest young rock climbers in the country. They went to climb Odell's Gully, an ice route in Huntington Ravine on the mountain's east side, serious ground. Well within their ability, they climbed on January 23rd, and they made a deliberate trade-off going in. To move fast for the summit, they dumped their overnight bivouac gear. That is a legitimate strategy on technical ground, and experienced climbers make it constantly. Speed is safety, because less time on the route means less exposure to whatever the weather does. But in the pile they left behind was the compass. Hold on to that. The whole accident turns on it. They climbed the gully. Heavy snow came in. They pushed for the top, stopped short of the summit, and started down. And the wind pushed them off their intended line. With no compass and nothing visible to correct against, they did what people have done in mountains, for as long as there have been mountains. They found running water and followed it downhill. Water goes where water goes. It took them into the Great Gulf, an enormous glacial basin gouged out between Washington and the northern peaks, with no road, no buildings, and no easy exit. Every step down felt like progress. Every step took them further from anyone who could help, into terrain that would take days to search, and they were doing it without the gear that would have let them survive a night on purpose rather than by accident. Below them, the temperature in the Gulf ran near 20 below. The search went out, and the storm that had trapped them became the search's problem too. On Sunday, the Mountain Rescue Service got into snow so blinding that members reported they could not see their own feet, and they withdrew. Rescuers were not simply looking for two climbers. They were fighting to stay functional themselves in the conditions that had already beaten two strong climbers. Monday, January 25th. Albert Dow and Michael Hartrick were working below treeline, following a set of footprints in the snow toward Lionhead. Footprints are the best lead a winter search ever gets. They crossed a slope, and the slope avalanched. Hartrick survived. Albert Dow, 28 by some accounts, 29 on the state's own list, was killed, struck by a tree in the moving snow. He had no obligation to be on that mountain. He was a volunteer going uphill toward two people he had never met. Now hold the two halves of that same day side by side. While the organized search was losing a man to an avalanche, Cam Bradshaw, a young woman who worked for the AMC at Pinkham Notch Camp, was out snowshoeing in the Great Gulf on her own time. She saw floundering tracks in the snow. She followed them and heard a faint call for help. She found Batser and Hare alive. She gave them raisins, water, a vest, and a wool shirt, and then she ran the trail out to tell the rescuers where they were. Dow followed tracks, and it killed him. Bradshaw followed tracks, and it saved 2 lives. Same technique, same mountain, same day. An organized multi-day operation of experienced rescuers cost one man his life and did not locate the subjects. One person on snowshoes, not part of the search, walked up the right drainage and did. Search in that terrain is not a technology problem, and it is not a competence problem. It is a problem of area, visibility, and time. And against those 3 things, effort is not a reliable input. The consequences were permanent. Both climbers survived with severe frostbite. Hare lost both legs below the knee. Batser lost a leg below the knee along with fingers and toes. What Hare did afterward is not a consolation ending, and it should not be told as one. Dissatisfied with the prosthetics available to him, he went into engineering and became one of the leading designers of powered prosthetic limbs in the world, running a research group at MIT. He has said publicly that Albert Dow's death is something he carries. The mountain took a rescuer's life and gave back a body of work that helps amputees walk. Both of those things are true, and neither cancels the other. The 1982 accident permanently changed how New Hampshire talks about mountain rescue because it forced a question nobody likes. How much risk should volunteers absorb for people who chose to be up there? The state later built an entire framework around that, a voluntary hike-safe card, and the legal ability to bill for rescues in cases of clear negligence. Those measures address cost and behavior. They do not change the fact that a rescuer must physically travel uphill into the same weather. Nothing has ever changed that. By now, all of this should have been solved. Forecasting for that summit is now genuinely excellent. The observatory has been staffed continuously since 1932, publishing a specific higher summits forecast that gives wind, temperature, wind chill, and visibility in usable detail, hours ahead. Personal locator beacons cost a few $100s, weigh a few ounces, and transmit a distress signal with GPS coordinates through a satellite network to a coordination center within minutes from anywhere. Clothing has improved beyond recognition. Hundreds of thousands of people reach the summit each year by foot, road, and rail. And on average, about 25 people a year need to be rescued off this mountain. Every one of those improvements is real. Not one of them touches the constraint. A forecast tells you what is coming. It does not shorten the distance you must cross to escape it, and it cannot force you to believe it. A beacon tells someone exactly where you are. It does not move them any faster. Better clothing extends the time you can survive exposure, which mostly means people now go further out before the clock starts. That is the pattern with every safety improvement in dangerous places. Capability raises the risk people are willing to accept, and the accepted risk expands to consume the new margin, which is how a person with the best available equipment, the best available forecast, and the best available fitness ends up in the worst possible situation. Kate Matrosova was 32, an experienced mountaineer who had climbed at altitude on multiple continents, physically formidable and thorough. On February 15, 2015, her husband drove her to the Appalachia Trailhead on the north side of the range and dropped her off at about 5 in the morning. Her plan was a traverse of the northern presidentials, Madison, Adams, Jefferson, Washington, a hard but well-known winter objective for someone at her level. She carried a spot satellite beacon. She had checked the forecast. The observatory 10 miles down the range was calling for gusts up to 125 miles an hour and wind chills around 70 below zero. She went anyway, and understanding why is more important than judging it. She was moving fast and light, starting in the dark to use the full day on terrain she had prepared for. Fast and light is how that traverse is done. Carrying gear to survive a night out there would have slowed her enough to guarantee one. The lower forest is sheltered. At 5 in the morning at the trailhead, the conditions on the ridge are an abstraction. Winter alpine travel routinely involves committing early and reassessing at tree line. And a traverse has a structural problem built into it. It is a one-way route. It does not loop back past your car. Every mile forward is a mile you would have to recross to retreat, in the same wind, on the same exposed ridge. The escape option gets worse as you go, and it gets worse invisibly. She summited Madison and continued. At around 3:30 in the afternoon, her beacon activated. That single act is the moment the objective changed. Nobody triggers a distress beacon while still completing a traverse. Where she was ultimately found, down in the coal near Star Lake rather than up on the ridgeline of the route, is consistent with someone who had stopped climbing and was trying to get off the exposed ground. The exact sequence remains uncertain, and nobody should pretend otherwise. Here is what that actually sets in motion, because the phrase, "she hit her beacon and rescue was launched," hides everything that matters. The signal goes up to a satellite constellation, down to a mission control center, and is passed to the Coordinating Rescue Authority, which routes it to New Hampshire Fish and Game, the agency legally responsible for backcountry rescue in the state. That part is fast, minutes. Then the process becomes physical. Teams have to be called out from wherever they were on a Sunday afternoon in February. Fish and Game conservation officers, Androscoggin Valley Search and Rescue, the Mountain Rescue Service. They have to gather, equip, and drive to trailheads. A New Hampshire Army National Guard Black Hawk was brought in, and a Civil Air Patrol Cessna flew to help pin down the beacon's position electronically. Then everyone has to get from the road to the ridge, which for a ground team means climbing thousands of vertical feet on foot. At night, in winter, carrying rescue gear. The beacon fired at 3:30. The first rescuers started up the trail at around 7 in the evening, 3.5 hours, and nobody had done anything wrong. That is simply what the sequence costs, and the location was less certain than the word beacon suggests. The signals coming off it were faulty, and a team working below tree line that night turned back in worsening weather, partly because the positions they were being handed did not hold still. They were not walking toward a dot on a map. They were covering ground. Aircraft could not close the gap either. A helicopter has to fly close to terrain, in wind gusting around 100 miles an hour along the ridgeline, in blowing snow, in failing light. Courage was never the variable. The question was whether the aircraft stays in the air at all, and whether putting a crew into that adds names to a search that already had one. The ground teams climbed into it. They were operating in temperatures around 20 below with wind over 100, on the same ridge that had already stopped her. Rescuers reported conditions that made forward movement barely possible. Late that night, the search was suspended. Not abandoned, suspended, because continuing meant losing rescuers, and every commander on that mountain has known since 1982 exactly what that costs. Think about what that suspension means. The beacon was transmitting. The general location was known. 40-plus people knew roughly where a woman was lying on that ridge, and the correct decision, the one any responsible commander would have made, was to stop and wait for daylight. The search resumed at first light on February 16th, with the wind on the ridge still gusting near 100. She was found early that afternoon at Star Lake, in the high ground between Madison and Adams, a short distance off the trail. Her headlamp was still on. She had died of hypothermia, and the accident report's reading of it is that she was most likely blown off her feet and could not get up and keep moving. That is the whole system in one case. The technology performed close to as designed. A signal went out, and it reached the right people fast. The failure was not in willingness or competence or coordination. The failure was that a human being has to walk up that mountain, and in those conditions a human being cannot. The American Alpine Club's account of it is blunt about the equipment, and it is worth repeating exactly because it cuts against how these devices are sold. Her lightweight, single-day approach left her without what she would have needed to survive a bivouac. And a beacon, the report says, cannot be your first line of defense. It is not gear. It is a request. Which means the honest way to think about a rescue on Mount Washington is not as an event but as a sequence, and every stage of it takes real time. Someone has to recognize that a person is in trouble, sometimes hours after it starts if nobody hit a beacon. An agency has to authorize a call-out and assemble volunteers who have jobs and families. Teams have to prepare and travel to a trailhead. Then they have to climb, on foot, at maybe a mile an hour in winter conditions, into the weather. Then they have to search an area where visibility might be 20 feet. Then they have to reach the person. Then they have to move the person off the mountain, which for an unconscious patient means a litter carry over boulders and ice by 6 to 8 people who are themselves cold and exhausted. Any stage can stall, and none of them can be skipped. A beacon compresses the first stage to almost nothing and leaves all the others exactly as long as they have always been. So put the whole machine together, because the point was never the wind speed. The storm tracks converge and make the pressure gradient. Most days the gap to the west collects that flow and delivers it, and on the worst day ever measured, it arrived from the other side entirely, because the summit has no sheltered face. The terrain lifts the air, and the stable layer aloft compresses it, so summit wind arrives at a multiple of valley wind that nobody standing in the valley can perceive. Tree line at 4,400 feet strips away shelter for the last 1,900 vertical feet on a mountain short enough to attract people who have never needed alpine judgment. Supercooled cloud freezes on contact and takes vision, which takes the cairns, which takes the route. Wind chill takes hands, then judgment. Roads, rails, hotels, huts, and forecasts increase the number of people exposed and reduce the experience required to be there. And rescue, no matter how well-funded or well-equipped or well-intentioned, still moves at walking pace uphill into the thing that caused the emergency. Take away any one of those links, and the mountain becomes ordinary. Not one of them can be taken away. The record keeps arguing with itself about the toll. The state park maintains a fatality list, carrying about 161 names. Other tallies run higher, and the list itself admits to including several vague causes, described as only indirectly associated with the mountain. Lizzie Bourne's date is disputed by a day. Albert Dow's age is given as 28 in some accounts and 29 in others. That disagreement is not sloppiness. It is what happens when a place accumulates deaths across nearly 2 centuries, in different jurisdictions, under different definitions of what counts. And none of this is history. On February 3, 2023, the summit crew recorded a temperature of 43 below zero, a gust of 127 miles an hour, and a wind chill of 108 below, believed to be the coldest wind chill ever recorded in the United States. The air temperature came within a few degrees of the observatory's all-time low of 47 below, which was set in 1934, the same winter as the big wind. When the 127-mile-an-hour gust hit, the metal latch on a summit door gave way and the door blew open. It took 3 people throwing their weight against it, plus help from the state park staff to get it shut again. That is the state of the art. 90 years of continuous measurement, a purpose-built structure, an experienced crew, and the emergency of the night is 3 adults holding a door. Now go up on a good day, which is most days. A calm morning in July. The gate at the base of the auto road swings open a little after 8, and cars begin the 7.5-mile climb. The cog fires up on the far side. At the top, there's a snack bar and a gift shop and a viewing platform, and on a clear day you can see into Vermont, New York, Maine, and out toward the Atlantic. Partway up the trails, there is a sign at Treeline. The Forest Service started putting these up in the 1920s, before the observatory existed, before anyone had measured a single gust up there. It reads, "Stop. The area ahead has the worst weather in America. Many have died there from exposure, even in the summer. Turn back now if the weather is bad." People walk past it in shorts, carrying a water bottle, into perfectly good visibility. Most of them will be fine. The sign is not wrong, and neither are they. The mountain is not waiting for them, and it is not choosing anyone. It is simply a piece of ground standing broadside to a continent's worth of moving air, with the trees stopping 1,900 feet too soon, and no way to tell from the parking lot which of those mornings turns.